So let's look at the available evidence and what Ofer Bar Yosef and others thought was the best explanation for how agriculture emerged in the Near East around 10,000 years ago. Okay, so what we saw so far is that, and this is an updated diagram. It's a little different than the way Ofer Bar Yosef would reconstruct it. Right? But in the beginning of the Natufian, the climate was warm and wet, right? And you can see that right here. Because it was warmer and wetter, these Natufian peoples were able to settle down. There was more food locally available. And you could sort of understand how they would become accustomed to a certain lifestyle. And also, as we saw from the evidence, they started to intensively cultivate certain plants like wheat and barley and lentils and things like that. But especially wheat and barley, the cereal grains. What happens is there is a cold snap in the weather right here. And this is known as the Younger Dryas because it's sort of a strange name, but it's because of a species of plant, and you see this in the reading, with the genus Dryas. Cold weather species is able to grow in southern latitudes during this period because there's obvious decrease in global temperature. So it's called the Younger Dryas, but what it essentially means is that there's a cold snap. Ofer Bar Yosef and others thought that the data showed there was also a drying out. And so you think about it. You had sedentism for a while. People were intensively collecting only wild plants and hunting wild animals. The population started to grow. And then during the Younger Dryas, the resources began to shrink up. There was less water, there was less rainfall, there was less food. And so this led to a resource stress. So the question becomes then, what would hunters and gatherers do as a result of this stress? And this is where, Ofer Bar Yosef believes that the changing environment really made a dramatic impact in human ways of life, and it sort of humans adapted to this new environment. Well, there are a couple of things that could have happened. One is that some of these hunters and gatherers could have gone back to becoming mobile hunters and gatherers again. And that's exactly what happened in some areas. Some of these Natufians become mobile again. Right? Now, the ones who chose to stay, right, what would they do? Well, in the areas that were a little bit better watered, they might start to cultivate the plants, right? That is, they might, instead of passively waiting for the plants like wheat and barley to return next season, and they sort of get what they get, they might try to increase the yield. How would they do that? Well, they might plant grains in areas where maybe they didn't grow before. They might try to bring water to these plants so that they would grow better. And, if you think about it, imagine these ancient Natufians, trying to get the wheat and the barley to grow in more abundant numbers. And as they come back after harvesting and they sort through the cereal grains, they would probably notice that some grains were larger than others. And they would decide to plant those next season. Then from that harvest, they might find that there were some seeds that were even larger, and they would decide to plant those seeds next season. So they're selecting. There's selective pressure for larger and larger grains that the humans are putting on them. They're propagating the ones that are best for their needs, and they're selecting for wheat and barley plants. They're slightly genetically different from the others, right? They yield larger seeds. Well, this will happen every single year, generation after generation. So over hundreds of years, the end result is a domesticated variety of wheat, a domesticated variety of barley, a domesticated variety of all of these plants. Right? And we see, more and more reliance on this. So according to Ofer Bar Yosef, right, because of this thing called the Younger Dryas, right, and in the 90s up to 2010, he believed that this occurred from about 9,000 to 8,300 BC. It's during this later Natufian period. The earlier Natufian period, they settle down. Things get worse. Some of these Natufians start to actively cultivate the plants, and that results in domestication. Right? So by the time that they have domesticated these plants, that's where archaeologists like Ofer Bar Yosef would draw the line and say, that is the beginning of the Neolithic. And because that part of the Neolithic did not have pottery yet, we call it the pre-pottery Neolithic. And the first period is the pre-pottery Neolithic A. Right? Okay, so to kind of recap what they believed. End of the Ice Age, climate gets warmer and weather. Natufians have more food. They settle down. They're sedentary hunters and gatherers. Then the Younger Dryas comes. Right? Then they settle down, and it's about 2,000 years where things are plentiful. So they get very accustomed to this kind of way of life. The climate gets cold and dry. People have a choice. They could either move or they could start trying to make these wild plants grow in more numbers. They start to do that in some areas by cultivating the plants. They start to select for certain plants that have better traits. Over hundreds of years of selection, this results in a new variety, a new species of these kinds of plants. And this is the Neolithic. So by the PPNA, they have domesticated plants. According to the data available at the time, they believe that they did not have domesticated animals yet, but they started to work and start selecting for certain traits for these animals. And by the next period, the PPNB, they domesticated animals successfully. Right? The first person, again, we said before, to divide the pre-pottery Neolithic into A and B was Kathleen Kenyon, famous archaeologist, who worked at Jericho. Here you can see some of her excavations at the site of Jericho. Next week we're going to talk more in depth about Jericho. But Jericho is a site, one of the oldest inhabited sites in the world, and it goes all the way back to the Natufian period. So, to kind of summarize again, according to the Ofer Bar Yosef and the people who ascribe to his theory, by the PPNA, people had domesticated plants because of all the things that occurred in the Natufian prior to that time period, and then they started to select for certain traits of animals, and by the PPNB, animals had been domesticated. Okay, the story is more complicated today because of research that's been done outside of the Fertile Crescent, outside of the Levant, I should say. Most of the work that was done, in the 70s and 80s and 90s was in the Levant. So we knew about that area better than others. That's why a lot of people thought that's where agriculture first appeared, and that's where that was the center of agriculture. Now that people have worked in other areas like Turkey and Iran, other parts of the Fertile Crescent, we know that there was parallel processes going on in those regions as well. Um, and there's work that's been done in terms of more accurate radiocarbon dating. It's also difficult to sort of draw the line as to when we can say, yes, now they have domestication. If they're working towards domestication, and maybe we see some transitions along the way, where do we actually say, okay, at this point, we have domestication? It could sometimes be complicated, and we also have to recognize that there's a long process before that that step as well. Some people, based on the data that's been collected since since Overbar Yosef's work, believe that in the late Natufian, actually, people became mobile again. And as they started to, leave those sites and become mobile, they couldn't have domesticated plants. And so these people believe that domestication occurred only after the Younger Dryas was over and the climate started to get warmer and wetter again. And they argue against Ofer Bar Yosef and say that climate change did not spur the Natufians to domesticate plants. Ofer Bar Yosef still believes that his theory is correct, and what he says in response to the criticism is that, and as we're going to see some documentation of this, he says if during the PPNA, the beginning of the PPNA, villages are much larger than they were in the Natufian. So if people were mobile and not practicing cultivation in the late Natufian, then how did the population get so big by the PPNA? And so he would say, obviously, they had to be cultivating and developing agriculture, or you couldn't have the population get that big by the beginning of the pre-pottery Neolithic A. People have also shown that domestication of plants and animals was taking place in multiple areas of the Near East around the same time. Some plants could have actually been domesticated more than once, independently in different areas. And so they're still trying to collect more data about this. Maybe barley was domesticated once in the Levant, but maybe it was also being domesticated separately in another part of the Middle East. So multiple things going on at the same time, not just one center where things are radiating out from there. Also, some archaeologists believe that animals were domesticated earlier than previously thought, and they were domesticated around the same time as plants. That's what some zooarchaeologists, people who focus on the study of animal bones, say. And there's also been changes in terms of dating. Things have gotten a little bit more complicated. If you ask certain people, okay, the ones who disagree with Ofer Bar Yosef, okay, so what pushed and spurred people to develop agriculture? That's something that's still being worked out by them. They don't have necessarily as clear an idea as Ofer Bar Yosef did in the 90s and 2000s. Okay, so now some archaeologists date these time periods to slightly earlier times. So, for example, the Natufian used to be 11,000 BC to 8,300 BC. Now some people date it to 12,500 to 9,700 BC. Now, what does this show? Sometimes people take the wrong message away from these kinds of changes. Sometimes people say, look, shows you that science is flawed, archaeologists don't know what they're talking about. On the contrary, this is the way science works, right? You develop a explanation based on the data you have. More data emerges and you have to revise your prior explanation. People are not saying, oh, this proves that agriculture never happened, or that it didn't happen in the Middle East. 10,000 years ago. No, it did. Obviously, all that's still the same. What they're arguing about is the timing of these events and what spurred these events on. Okay, well, you could sort of imagine once you have full-fledged agriculture, plants and animals, the population is really going to get larger because now you can produce a lot more food. And that's what we see with the villages. So a typical Natufian village, might be, this is a National Geographic little image. They say around 18 people. Some people say 25 people. But around the size of a typical hunting and gathering community, and then slowly start to get bigger during the Natufian. Now, before we look at the size of PPNA and PPNB sites, let's look at this question before. From what we saw of the Natufian, in terms of location of sites, the types of artifacts, does it look like there's evidence for warfare between these Natufian villages? Does it look like warfare existed in the Natufian time period? And remember that these sites, some of them were in open air, open valleys like so. We saw sickle blades, we saw mortars and pestles. We did not see any kinds of walls around communities. We didn't see, weapons, and we saw, these sites in areas that were not on tops of hills, undefended places, right? So if you put that all together, you could make the argument there's really no evidence that there's warfare at this time period in these communities. There's just nothing to support that idea. So it looks like they were relatively peaceful at this time. Things start to change later on, but at this point they're relatively peaceful. And some people even argue if you had warfare, you wouldn't have they wouldn't have been able to domesticate plants and animals. They would have been too busy defending themselves. So by the PPNA, you start to see new things develop. Now villages are 90 people. So, we're talking about maybe 5 times the size of a Natufian village. People still living in these round houses, but now they develop communal storage areas. And so this is a granary. The way it would be constructed, and you could tell granaries archaeologically because what you find are mud brick or stone supports that would elevate the floor, a wooden floor, above the surface of the ground. And that's important because if the grain is resting right on the ground surface, water or moisture could seep up and it will spoil the grain. So what they did was they built these things in such a way that the floor was elevated above the ground, there was air circulation below it, so the grain would stay dry, it would keep moisture out. So these granaries are very recognizable archaeologically, and it looks like there's a big emphasis on sharing in the community in the PPNA because there's one granary for the entire community. Now this changes in the PPNB. There's more of a focus on private property and private storage, and we're going to see some of the other changes that occur, but you can already see now in the PPNB, once you have domesticated animals and domesticated plants, now the villages are 900 people. And you also can see that there's an architectural change. As these communities get bigger, you see that they go from round houses to square houses. And that's something we'll talk about more next week when we look at sites where we really can see this change. Okay, next thing we're going to talk about is domestication. And what I want you to do is to take a look at this video I have up on a fox experiment that occurred in the old Soviet Union that gives us a lot of insight into how the process of domestication works. And then come back and watch part 4 of this week's videos, and we'll look a little bit more at domestication.